city council, Vanessa Paul Harper. I prayed for the mayor of this city, G.T. Bynum. I prayed for Representative Goodwin and Senator Matthews. I prayed for the community leaders, activists, preachers, concerned citizens, all who are here tonight. Pray for those who are on their way. God, give us your grace. You know the terrible sin that occurred here in this city. Help us, oh God, to remember the story of the Bible. Joseph died in Egypt, told his children's children, not to let him linger, but take him home to his homeland. We pray, dear God, that you show us where these bodies are, and that we can put them at rest in their home, in their homeland, Greenwood, that you show us your mercy, forgive us for our sins, and help your truth come to light. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. Amen.
Advisory committee, and I know that they were introduced that I heard the first meeting.
Good evening, my name is Greg Robinson, I'm organizer with the Affairs Foundation and a member of the African American Affairs Commission.
Hi, my name is Sherry Johnson-Smith. I'm the president, CEO, and co-founder of the Black Wall Street Chamber of Commerce.
Chief Amushan, president of the African Ancestral Society, also the founder of the Real Black Wall Street Tour, and president of the Black Wall Street Memorial March Movement.
You should tell the people that the founders, the forward platform.
Chair of the 1992 Commission commemorated youth as well as Black Wall.
I am Regina Goodwin, state representative of House District 73, and I'm a descendant of race massacre survivor.
Nick Doctor, I'm representing the Even Status Commission.
Jerry Kimbrough Jr., descendant of Dr. Kimbrough.
Sherry Laxton,
Amy Brown, Deputy Mayor, City of Tulsa.
I've already screwed this up.
Robert Brown, pastor of the Story of Birmingham, and then the Episcopal Church.
G.T. Bynum, the Mayor of Tulsa.
Vanessa Harper, District 1 City Council. I want to thank our mayor and our councilor, Paul Harper, for their commitment to moving forward with this investigation. And I think we're very fortunate under their leadership to be here. One of the things both have said is that they want complete transparency on every step that's being taken to complete this investigation. So we're very proud and very thankful that you're out this evening. And at the end of the presentation this evening, you will be able to have comments and ask questions. So now I want to introduce, because tonight we're going to be on the investigation process, and so I want to introduce to you, and I hope I do not mispronounce any names, so I'm going to do this very well, I hope. From the investigation committee is Scott Hammerstead, is that correct? He is the senior researcher at Oklahoma State Archaeological Survey. We have Carol Stackback, is that correct? Oklahoma State Archaeologist, Phoebe Sutherfield, Research Assistant. scientist at University of Tulsa. And Leslie Rankin Hill, associate professor. And of course, Scott Ellsworth. We're very happy that they're here. So I'm going to turn it over unless Mary you have. We will begin with the presentation, and we will after the presentation, then we will have some questions and comments for you. And we really do welcome this because it is very important that we hear from you as well. So if there are any questions, any comments that you want to bring forth, any information that you have that will help us in moving forward and what we're trying to accomplish, is indeed appreciated. Thank you, and sit back, and this is going to be very informative this evening. But first, before we do that, Nick Doctor, the staff person will provide you the purpose of the
Thank you, Senator Horner, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I wanted to provide a quick recap of our first meeting, since this is the second one that we've held, the Public Oversight Committee meeting. Go over a little bit of the meeting format, so move to where the next steps, and then I'll hand it off to Scott to kick us off with the presentation. So our first meeting focused on a comprehensive overview of the comprehensive process that we intend to take. As you see, Michelle in the back telling me to eat the microphone, so we're doing that as well. Our first meeting that we held in June focused on providing an overview of the comprehensive process that we intend to take for this investigation, and verifying this intent to treat this as a murder investigation that it is for our city. That work is being led by the Public Oversight Committee that you see here tonight. And thank you all for volunteering your time and being a part of this process with us. In addition, we have two committees that are also assisting us in this work and guiding us with their expertise. The Physical Evidence Investigation Committee that you'll hear from tonight bring the technical expertise and the experience to lead this investigation for due diligence that it needs. And we'll be hearing a lot more in detail around the technology and the steps that they intend to take as part of that investigation tonight. And the second committee is our Historical Context and Narrative Committee that will be focusing on gathering and collecting evidence from the public, helping our community discuss this issue and making sure that we're discussing the history of the event and are hoping to educate our community on that, and our archives for future generations to view this work and you can continue to learn from what we'll discover through this process. We also discussed the three initial sites that we prioritized, and we'll discuss those more this evening as well, based upon the work of the state of Oklahoma's commission to study the Tulsa race riot in 1921 that was completed in 2001. A majority of the comments we received in our first meeting were focused on the oral history and family traditions and documents that pointed to possible other sites for burials from the race massacre. And so I wanted to be clear tonight that the three sites we'll be discussing tonight are what we view as phase one. And that the Historical Context and Narrative Committee will be collecting those narratives, those histories, and those documents as we go through this process to ensure that we have those sites available as we go through future investigative processes. I also want to let you know that you can provide information on those histories, your experiences, both on the comment cards that are available tonight, as well as on the City of Tulsa's website online at cityoftulsa.org/1921 careers. Tonight's meeting, as I mentioned already, is going to be focused upon detailed overview from the Physical Evidence Investigation Committee, a thorough review of both the process that they can undertake and the technology they'll use, and ultimately what kind of results we can expect as we reconvene to go through those results. We're fortunate to be joined by a very talented team, so thank you all for Senator Horner already introduced for being here, some traveling from across the country to be able to provide their expertise for us tonight. For some quick housekeeping, tonight's meeting is being recorded by the city and will be uploaded to that same website, again, cityofTulsa.org/1921 graves for people to view both afterward and going forward. It's also being live streamed on the City of Tulsa's Facebook page, so if you're on Facebook, please share that so we can have as many people view this as possible to be able to provide their insight. And finally, as Senator Horner mentioned, after that presentation, the Physical Evidence Investigation team will be receiving public comment hearing from the public comment, or from the public at every step of this process. So after you hear from the investigative team, we'll open the floor for public comment, following standard council rules of 5 minutes per speaker. And so please work with Christina on the microphone and provide your contact information so we can follow up with you on those comments afterward as well. With that, Senator Horner, I'm done with my comments. Is there anything that I missed? Perfect. Scott, can I invite you to come up?
Okay, well, thank you. My name is Scott Amherstead. I'm the senior researcher at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, and I head up the survey's geophysical arm. So what I was asked to come here to do today is talk about the technologies that we're going to use as part of this investigation, just give a little brief overview of how they work and what we're going to use. So we use the term remote sensing. It's a catch-all term for a bunch of different techniques. More than just the one we're talking about today, but also including things like LiDAR, some of those other things, mapping, ground penetrating radar, radiometry. We want to use multiple techniques in this type of investigation for a variety of reasons, as you'll see as I continue to talk. Basically, each site we're looking at is unique. It has a different history, different depositional soils all the way down to different types, people, different type of landscapes, and it's gone. Okay. I'm going to just lean in and make myself comfortable, I guess. This will work. I've been in the field all week. In case you haven't noticed, it's really hot out, so I just what I So the sites are unique. The different techniques we have will complement each other in different ways, and this will become more clear again as I keep going. And so it's best to use more than one type of instrument so that you're guaranteed to get the best results that you have. This is a process that we use pretty extensively in archaeology. We've been developing it at the survey for the past about 12 years since I've been there. And it's working really well for us, in both on pre-contact Native American sites, historic period sites, and also finding missing graves and cemeteries. So it's been very successful for us. There's two different types of techniques we're using here. One of them is called an active technique, and the other one is passive. And active is something that just induces a field to get a response. So ground penetrating radar shoots a pulse into the ground and bounces back. Whereas something like a gradiometer is more passive and it uses something that's existing. And what we're looking for basically are contrasts in the soil. Anything that humans have done sort of bumps up the natural stratigraphy and makes it easier for us to find things. So it's the contrast between introduced or archaeological features or burials in this case and the natural background in the soil. So here just sort of this picture on the right is a famous archaeological example, but we would pick up, we have sort of the horizontal stratigraphy coming across here, but then something like this big tree pit right here, or this pit right here, those are the kind of things that will show up really nicely in our equipment. And what we propose to use for this project is magnetometry, electrical resistance, and ground penetrating radar. And I'll talk a little bit about how each of these work and the pros and cons that we have of using them on various projects. So first, talking about magnetometry, what magnetometry does is detects really subtle magnetic variations in soil. And we can measure the strength of this variation. So you have to deal with the Earth's magnetic field as a whole, but then buried objects like this wall right here will have a different type of magnetism that's created when those bricks are baked in a certain region that pops up, and there will be a higher magnetic signature than the soil around you. And we walk over it with the here's somebody with the radio on the right. I love this image because it's so terribly drawn. So it makes me laugh every time. But basically, you walk across over that particular feature with the magnetometer, which is this thing, and it'll detect that difference in the magnetic field between the bricks and the soil around it. And magnetic variation can be created by both natural and cultural processes, both of which we can measure with radiometry. In natural processes, topsoil becomes magnetized over a period of time, and firing can increase soil magnetism. Now, if somebody comes through and digs a hole and backfills it with magnetized topsoil, that pit or hole will show up more prominently in our data than the surrounding soils around it. There's also a ton of cultural processes, and these are the ones that they're equally important, but these cause a little more problems because we all know as humans we tend to muck things up fairly nicely. By making fires, building things with fire material like the bricks I just mentioned, Human occupation magnetically enriches soil by throwing our trash sort of into it. We also can accumulate or subtract layers of topsoil, and people can bring in stone, other material, and make sort of iron artifacts. What we're seeing here, the image that's of more interest here is the one on the right. That is a cemetery in Mississippi. Every single one of those little tiny white boxes is a grave that shows up as a sort of shallow depression where the topsoil was removed when they excavated the grave and not put back in at the end. So by walking across it, the black areas are higher magnetism, the white areas are lower magnetism. We can pick up that the topsoil was removed in these particular areas. And sort of the same thing on the left. We have vehicle tracks that remove topsoil. The cattle trail here, they've been around the cattle line, they kind of walk back and forth in the same place. By doing that over time, we push that topsoil out and make it less magnetic so we can pick up on it. The big advantage of a magnetometer is it's fairly easy to operate, and it's pretty fast, you can cover large areas at once. This is a shot of the spiral bounce down in Florida. Down in Florida County. And we've been doing geophysical survey down there for about the last decade or so. But we're able to cover very large areas. We generally work in about a 20 by 20 meter block, so about 60 feet on the side. And we can cover one of those blocks in about 5 minutes with the magnetometer. So we really get a larger landscape area that we can look at. The disadvantage of it is that it's, in this case, it's both disadvantage and advantage. The disadvantage of it is it's really sensitive to metal objects. So when you're in the field, you can't be wearing any metal. You can't have earrings in it. You can't have, I got a titanium ring because it doesn't interact with it, which is nice. But I can't wear my glasses because they've got a steel pin in them. So that's hard for the data collection. But in this case, it's good because we're looking for historic objects. So there might be people are going to have belt watches or buttons, and those metal objects are going to have a signature that's going to go to the top and be radiometry. Also, we're looking for coffin furniture like hinges and things like that will show up as the nails that are being used to hold those coffins together. So that's one good thing about this particular project. It might make it slightly easier for us with the magnetometer than with some other cases. The next technique we're going to talk about is electrical resistance. And what it does is basically measures the resistance of the moisture content of soil to an electrical current. And that's what this thing is right now. This is the array itself. I get to go to some places sometimes to do this kind of stuff. But what this is it's attached to some remote probes, and by jabbing these mobile probes in the ground, these three spikes here, that basically completes the electrical current circuit and lets that current travel through the soil. And things like rocks will have a different resistance to that current than something like a void or something created by a barrier. And this is sort of I crib this together from class IT, so I can try to keep it less technical as possible. But we have two types of features we look at, basically what we call intrusive soils, which are those that are dug into the soil. So it can be higher resistance because they have less moisture, or we have earth under disturbed soil features, which are lower contrast because they hold moisture. This could be higher or lower resistance depending on what's going on. And the image I have here is a grave that we found at Combination Cemetery. And the results are at the top, and sort of the anomaly we found at the bottom. It's this really subtle little white dot right there, an area of lower resistance that was caused by the grave being dug and filled back in and having the texture and consistency of that grave shaft being a different resistance to the external undisturbed soil. So we were able to find that, and then fortunately for us, they just exposed a little bit of stuff for a burial or a road they were going to build. And there's the grave right there, just in line with all of the rest of it. So it turned out pretty nicely for us. Every cemetery out there has generally lost people. About every 4 or 5 years I'm on the news. And so now I expect I'm going to be hearing from a lot of these people who are going to see me and ask for me and my staff to come help. For the record, my staff is being never aggressive because I'm able to drink that. They tend to make themselves scarce after a while. Okay, so this is basically the same thing, but it's just showing some other examples of where this worked. Here's another area right here, a large area of lower resistance. This was a gully that was back with a bunch. So back in about 10,000 years ago, Native Americans drove a herd of bison in that gully, killed a bunch of them in place, butchered them, left the bones in place, and the gully filled up with soil. When you walk across it, you have no idea there's a gully even there. It was just as flat as this stage. But when we got out there with the electrical resistance meter, it really showed up where all those bones were as an area of much less resistance. So we were able to find this particular machine. The nice part about it is it's not affected by metal, so it doesn't have the problems that the gradiometry has. It can detect very subtle anomalies, such as that grade in the Ponca Cemetery. But it can be really affected by soil conditions. It's actually nice now that it's finally stopped raining for a while. If we were to try to do this in May, it probably wouldn't have worked because the features themselves would have been so saturated, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between that and the surrounding soils. And it's a lot slower. I mentioned that the gradiometer takes about 5 minutes for a grid, 20 by 20 meter grid. The resistance meter takes between 35 and 45 minutes, depending on how hot it is and how fast you can move yourself up. And the last one, the one that most people have probably actually heard of, is ground penetrating radar. And I did bring one that's sitting on the front here. I brought it and hooked it up, so when this is all over, if anybody wants to push it around and watch what comes across the screen, you're more than welcome to. And this is another active method. As I mentioned earlier, it's an antenna that sends a radar pulse that reflects off of a buried object and coming back and sort of back up. And what this tells us two things. It can tell us the depth that object actually is, and it can tell us the way we do the data collection is you just walk back and forth with this thing like it's a lawnmower. So you get a horizontal picture of what's down there as well as a vertical picture. So it can tell you how big something is on the surface and also how deep it is. This is the one that, again, this is the one that drives me a little crazy sometimes thanks to shows like CSI. One thing it's not going to show you is not going to show you the actual skeleton unless you're incredibly fortunate. The only time I know that's actually happened was down in Jamestown where a guy had a handheld unit, a little tiny thing, and he put it right on top of a coffin. Like if the coffin was buried that deeply, he was actually able to get the outline of the bones. But that is the only time I've ever heard of that actually working. That will not happen with any of the machines that we've got, unfortunately. So the way this works is the wave will go down, and the velocity of that wave will change depending on the material they travel through. And by knowing the velocity allows us to determine the depth. So that's just sort of an example. This little curvy thing here is what I'm talking about with the wave. It's one pulse with that radar. And as it goes through different soil types, this is dry soil over here. It just zips right through it real fast. Over here, it hits something wet and it slows down. That's what that's showing. And here it's sort of in the middle. So again, soil tissue conditions are going to be pretty important here. But knowing what the soil is and knowing how dry or wet it is going in allows you to program the machine to figure that sort of thing out. I wanted to conclude this by just showing some examples of GPR in cemeteries. There's easy ones, there's not so easy ones, and there's really confusing ones. The easiest ones are when you're seeing a modern burial that'll have a concrete burial vault that might have some rebar or something like that in it. That's what you see here. There's the top of the casket. There's really strong reflection. Same thing here and right here. If I can go back real quick. This is the century chest time capsule. It was excavated in the First Lutheran Church in Oklahoma City in 2013. It was a copper-covered casket, or copper box inside of a concrete-lined burial vault in the floor of the church. And I think you don't have to know much about radar to be able to see that there's something actually there. But that's kind of the best kind of signature that you're going to get out of this whole thing. Okay, so there's the easy ones. And then you have the really confusing ones where most cemeteries have. And this is the kind of situation we've been dealing with in this case. Is there's stones here, but there's all sorts of people. There's supposed to be a man and his wife buried here. She's there, he's not. And then there's all these other burials out here that aren't supposed to be there. This is why I said cemeteries track you down and don't want to try to find things. But I wanted to show this example because this is the kind of thing we'll be looking for as part of the geophysical survey. Would be the isolated burials, isolated graves that aren't under markers that might show up doing this type of survey. So, that being said, thanks very much for your time. And if anybody wants to push the cart around, I'll stick around for a little while.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield. My title on the agenda says Research Assistant Scientist. That is my work title at the University of Florida. I am a forensic anthropologist. I've been a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences since about 1997, and I became involved in this project as a ABD graduate student because my parents grew up in Tulsa, and Leslie connected me to this project because we were both skeletal biologists. We examine human skeletal remains. And so I wanted to contribute some thoughts to the recovery phase of this project to give you some background on what we might expect. And the conditional is something I have to emphasize here. So I'll talk for a few moments, but if you have any questions, please hold on to your questions and bring them up at the end because I'm quite welcome to answer them. So what is forensic anthropology? Any of you watch Bones? Yeah. So it's that with less Asperger's. And less magic because we don't use holograms to reconstruct identities, but the goal of forensic anthropology, its primary goal is to reconnect people with their identities from their skeletons. Our secondary goal is to tell their end story. Sometimes that end story doesn't affect their skeleton, but if it does, we're here to describe that. So in this case of the Tulsa Race Massacre, my involvement here is in part out of personal investment because I spent many a summer here in Tulsa because my parents grew up in Tulsa. And it was working on the initial report for this project that finally got my father to understand what I did. And I'll take that. But in this current context, I'm still looking to reconnect individuals as well as we can to their identity and to their families if possible. But I want us all to be realistic. A century has passed. And one of the issues we contend with, the world of forensic anthropology, is preservation. We have a complicated word for preservation. We use taphonomy. I don't know why. It's a Greek word, but at any rate, preservation is what keeps us from knowing, will our recovery phase be, like endless episodes of bones where there's complete skeletons and you can lay them out in order, or will each recovery, each of the sites we visit or each burial in the site, will it yield this much material? We won't know. From my own experience, places like the Plains, I spent 15 years in North Dakota. It's completely a plain state. Preservation there is excellent. People who died hundreds of years ago show up perfectly, even infants. And people with hair still have hair. Sometimes, well, at any rate, preservation excellent. But in Florida, where I did my graduate work and where I have returned, we raced the clock. In weeks, roots will have invaded skeletal material and bones in water from car accidents frequently. The bones will be etched just from the acid content in the water. And what's the context here? Oklahoma's a little bit of plains and a little bit of red clay soil. We have a little bit of that in Florida, and it's not the poorest level of preservation, it's second poorest. So we won't know what we're faced with until we do these excavations and see what kind of settings we're dealing with. And in regards to that, though, we may not be able to connect individuals with their identities. Their identities were from 100 years ago. Even for those, will there be people looking for them? Even in the world of DNA analysis, we're considering that as a whole separate question. It's not a part of this model right now because we know we're looking at, will we recover sufficient remains to begin with the first question, is it human? And then if we pass that question, will we be able to say male, female? I mean, I'm assuming from a forensic context, most of them will be male because that's typically what happens in circumstances like these, but we're expecting historically that some of them won't be male. Will we be able to place them in the context of their passing? And by that I mean, will these be individual burials? Will they be multiple individuals? Will they be placed together in a burial in a way where we'll say, oh, this is contextually appropriate for the people we're looking for? Will they be burned remains? From the historical context, we would expect that. And will there be artifacts with the remains? By artifacts, anything from clothing to if people were shot, will we recover bullets? After 100 years, bullets in the location of the remains that received the shot, we'll only know for sure if there's damage to the skeleton. Gunshot wounds do have characteristic defects, but again, we're against preservation. So we won't know until the recovery begins what kind of data we will get from these remains. So I say that to say, I mean, I present this not to be the killjoy for those of you who are eager to get these stories told. It's really an idea to frame what kind of timeline are we interested in. Because recoveries like this, where there are multiple sites, there could be individual burials, there could be multiple individuals in a burial. Recoveries like this, you can have two different strategies, or maybe at least two. You could have the strategy that excavation to skeleton material is the goal, not meat excavation, just get the bones out of the ground, sift out everything skeletal, every artifact, every nail, every bullet, sift those out. You don't get the full context, but you have completed the excavation. That is a legitimate strategy. It's not information rich, but you will get your project finished. And then there's the other end where you brush every fragment into position, map every piece in, every layer down, even when individuals are stacked up together. You get full context. You may not get any more information other than the arrangements of individuals to each other or within a single individual within a burial, but you maximize your chance of getting information. And we won't know until the actual excavations proceed and we start seeing remains which context will ultimately be in, especially with multiple sites. Part of that I leave to the archaeologists. They're probably sitting there going, no, we're only going to do one way. But if preservation is very poor, we'll find out. We'll find out. So just remember the two goals, because for my work, I will be approaching this as if I want to send these people home, to whichever home they will have. I would hope to be able to identify them well enough to know the difference between a race massacre victim versus a cemetery whoops. And two of these sites are cemeteries. And so I'm assuming there'll be individuals that have nothing to do with the race massacre, but are in the location we want to search. And I don't mean formally buried, I just mean they just happen to be there. And we will have in our plan some strategy to deal with those individuals as well, because we just have to have a home for them as well. So that's the general context in which we'll be working.
I've been told I have 10 minutes, so I better make sure I don't go over time here. Well, good evening. How y'all doing? Good. Well, it's great to be back home in Tulsa, and it's great to be home great to be back at Rudisill Library. And in 1982, Mozella Jones, John and Franklin's sister, threw the first ever book party for Death in the Promised Land here, so I'm happy to be back. I do want to do one thing, though, and she's going to look at me with a stern look, but I do want to ask if Leslie Rankinhill, Dr. Rankinhill, would you at least wave to everybody? Leslie brought Phoebe to us. brought Phoebe to us 20 years ago during the Riot Commission era, and Leslie's been a key member of our team too. So I want to talk about the three sites and give you a brief overview about how we got there, but what we're really doing is we're doing a continuation of work that we did 20 years ago during the era of the Riot Commission, and which was to not only to try to determine the number of deaths in the massacre, excuse me, I'm used to using an older term, but also the location of where riot victims were buried in unmarked graves. And our work was cut short, but a lot of what we're doing today is based on that. And we did quite a bit of work over the period of 2 years. We scoured offices, government offices, private businesses, funeral homes, mortuary companies, archives, not only in Tulsa and Oklahoma, but also in Washington, D.C., Dallas, Texas, and whatnot. Over the course of 2 years, we interviewed or spoke with or met with more than 420 individuals to try to narrow down the three sites, that we eventually came to. So this is, we're building upon that work and work which really has never been discussed in a public phase before. I didn't ask for any, do we have the Oaklawn slides? Why don't you pull up Oaklawn and let me just talk briefly about the three sites as well. But let me say this first of all, which is that, there are a lot of potential places in Tulsa or Tulsa County where riot victims may have been buried. It's important to remember a few things. First of all, the majority of riot victims were buried during the period of martial law, which happens for 3 days at the close of the massacre, when Tulsa's African American population was held under armed guard at the ballpark, at the fairgrounds, and other things. All right, so the burials are happening where families are losing loved ones and they have no idea what has happened to their loved ones or where those remains might have been, where those bodies might have been put. So that's a feature of stuff. So we have burials that are done, oftentimes strangers burying strangers. Some of these burials, we think it is entirely whites who are involved in the actual directing the burials. Others, in one situation, we think it is African Americans burying fellow African Americans, and others, they're quite complicated. When we started to do the work, it was difficult just to begin. There wasn't a lot of evidence in any contemporary documents at the time. There was an important article written by Walter White of the NAACP, who came to Tulsa right after the riot. He interviewed O.T. Johnson, who was the commandant of the local Salvation Army. Johnson told White that he had hired a number of grave diggers over 3 nights, and that they dug something of the order of 100 graves, and they put an African American riot victim in each grave. But it didn't tell where these graves were. So what my assistant, Dick Warner of the Tulsa Historical Society, and I did is we began by going to all the cemeteries in town, and also funeral homes and whatnot, trying to find the degree of records. And what came out very early was as a place of focus would be Oaklawn Cemetery here. Does this other mic work? It says Fox on it. Oh my God. Let's put that one back. Sorry, Fox. Can y'all hear me or not? Okay, so this is Peoria Avenue. This is 11th Street. This part is not in the cemetery, incidentally. It doesn't exist. So Oaklawn was a city-owned cemetery that predated the massacre. There was an African-American section here. There's also a Potter's Field. That's where indigent individuals, a white Potter's Field, a black Potter's Field together. And so we had originally started to thinking this might be it, where perhaps these 120 graves or whatever they were buried. We did a lot of focus on that. There are also 2 headstones of known riot survivors, both African American, Eddie Lockhart and Reuben Everett. But there was no reason to know why the headstones were where they were. They were also quite close together. But the records had either disappeared or were incomplete. The records that the city had, we had just lots of areas where there were no headstones if you drive by them. And then we caught a break. We went to a local funeral home, and we talked our way back into the back and found some old ledgers from 1921 where the funeral home had billed people for a burial. And we found that 18, I believe the number is 18 or 19, unidentified African Americans, men, had been buried by the, I believe it was the Mowbray Funeral Company, in Oak Lawn Cemetery. They would say unidentified Negro, male, gunshot wound, or, you know, burned or whatnot. But there was no telling where they were buried. It would be just number 1, number 2, number 18. They charged the county for the burials, and there wouldn't be row 7, section B, grave number 12, any of that stuff. So we were sort of caught with that, and then later on, maybe a year and a half later, a lot of attention was given to our efforts, and we got a lot of information from the public. One is, do you notice here how the little bit of this cemetery is cut off? Well, that was cut off in the early 1970s when the interdispersal loop of this freeway was built, and they end up shaving a bit of that of the cemetery away. You can go and see it today. I got a call from a white construction worker. He would not give his name at the time. He said he was on that crew that excavated that, and he said we found bones all over the place. All right, and that what happened to them, nothing as far as he knew. We can discuss that later on. But then we got another call as well too, by an elderly white gentleman by the name of Clyde Eddy, about 88 years old. Clyde grew up at about 10th and Quaker. He would often cut through Oak Lawn Cemetery on the way downtown, and perhaps on 2 days after the riot, he's cutting through the cemetery. He comes upon a team of a group of white workmen who've got a team of mules, and they have something called a slip that's used to dig a trench. Nearby there are huge packing crates, wooden packing crates, the type that he described that oil field equipment would be in. He said he went up, he's about 11 years old at the time, lifted the lid, saw 5 bodies in it, goes to the next one, lifted the lid, saw bodies in that as well too. At this point, the white workmen yell at him and his friend and say, get out of there. Well, all they did is they just walked to the sidewalk where there's a fence, and they just hung out there and watched this until they went along. So we, after this discovery, we did take, in ground penetrating radars, the technology's changed. The stuff that Scott has described, it's not perfect, but it's better now. But we did find an anomaly in the soil at the location that Mr. Eddy described to us. Okay, can I now go to Booker T. Washington Cemetery? So this is historic Booker T. Washington Cemetery. Anybody know where it is? Anybody been out there? Very good. So it's at 91st Street between Memorial and Sheridan, a long ways away from town. It's a historic African American cemetery that predates the massacre. There's also another historic African American cemetery, Abraham Lincoln Cemetery, as well there. We had gone out there. It had been family owned by a white family for decades. The family members got older. The records started to disappear. A new group came in and bought the cemetery. This is around 1997, 1998. They were trying to find out where people were buried in it. And we ended up talking to a cemetery worker there who told a very compelling story about meeting an elderly African American woman who, these are sort of the two main areas where bodies or where African American burials took place. And this woman pointed out a certain area right here. She was a riot survivor. And she said that area right there is where the riot victims were buried, the cemetery. And we tried every way that we could to track her down, to find her. We never found her. But in fact, we sort of staked out the cemetery the next Memorial Day for 12 hours, waiting for her to arrive, and we tried all this stuff. It didn't work. But after this long day out there, and nothing happening, and we're a little bit depressed, and we haven't found anything, a riot survivor that had not come to the attention of the commission members at this point, a gentleman by the name of Elwood Lett showed up. A very small man, grew up in Tulsa, survived the riot as a child, spent most of his life out on the West Coast, and moved back to Tulsa, living in one of the little apartments off Greenwood Avenue. And I met him, and he took me, and without me saying anything about this woman's story, he took me to the exact same area, and he told me a story that about 3 years after the riot, he was playing in that area with one of his cousins, and as soon as he was in that exact same area, his parents started yelling, "Get out of there, that's where the riot victims are buried." Okay? So we subsequently took ground penetrating radar there as well too. There are some anomalies in the soil. Okay. And finally, the third side, if you could flip me to New Block Park. Look, there's all right, so here's the 244 bridge. There's the river you can sort of see right here. There's a railroad bridge here. There have been a lot of buzz in the oral tradition, white and black in town, that bringing us this area. There is certainly a belief that some bodies were thrown into the Arkansas River. That could certainly have happened, no question about that, but we don't think they all were. There was talk about the city incinerator that existed at New Block Park at the time. We determined through Clyde Snow that the incinerator would not have been able to burn bodies. It couldn't have gotten hot enough. It would have been too difficult to make this happen. Remember, this is June. You're talking about a number of bodies. After 3 days, they're starting to expand, explode, all of this. You've got to get rid of these things very quickly. All right, so we keep hearing all of these stories. We hear stories about the railroad bridge and all this stuff, and we can't figure out anything. And then we catch a story about a gentleman by the name of Jack Britton, who was, he died before we heard this story, but was a concrete finisher, white guy from the west side, grew up on the west side. And he told a story that in around 1945, at the end of the war, he was walking along the railroad tracks, which are right along here, which border onto New Block Park, and that he came upon a group of workmen who were digging some kind of a swimming pool, and that they were finding all of these bones, and that he left with an understanding that these were riot victims' bones that were being discovered. Okay. So we didn't talk to Britton, but Dick Warner and I think we interviewed 50 people on this. We finally found people who, Jack Britton, who did not know any of these people did not know each other. He told the same story to somebody in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Is this story true? Is it not true? We don't know, but we know this, that he told a consistent story. But here's a problem. Some of you all may or may not know, but there used to be a swimming pool in New Block Park. I swam there in the 1960s. It was probably segregated. That's probably why they closed it, frankly. But it was built in 1927. So that doesn't help us at all. So we're stuck by this story that sounds good, but we don't know. Then Dick Warner had the brilliant idea of going to the Water and Sewer Department, and he found out that in 1945 there was a sewage lift pump station that was built quite near the tracks. This might be an area as big as this stage that to a young teenager looking down might have thought that was a swimming pool. So we once again did ground penetrating radar there as well. There are some anomalies in the soil. That doesn't mean that we found something in any of these places. Let me close with this, and I know you all are going to want some questions. We probably identified 25 potential sites for the burials of riot. Some are ludicrous. People called in and said they're all buried in the bottom of the basement of the Brady Theater. Others are sort of impossible. There used to be coal mines at 21st and Yale where Sears were. Oh, they dumped them all down there. We'd hear a lot of stories, get certain sites here and there. Here's the deal. If you don't have a piece of land that you can point to, and if it isn't a pretty finite area, you're not going to find anything. In this area right here, this little tiny area, you could bury 100 bodies. Now, imagine how many of these kind of areas are in this building, in the parking lots nearby. The world gets very big, early on. So these are the 3 sites that we have identified that we think have the most positive potential for possibly finding something. But as Phoebe has the voice of doom and gloom, but it's really kind of the voice of reality is we may not find anything at any of these sites. Or we may not find a mass grave. We might find the remains of 3 people we were confident are 5 victims. So I think we all have to be prepared. This is really unprecedented work that we're doing. I really can't think of anywhere in the country where there's been so much effort already put in. There's ongoing effort as well too. And please know that just because you may not hear from us for a few months, we're not laying around. Everybody's doing this work. We're doing this because we're committed to. I'm not getting paid to do this. I've driven from Ann Arbor, Michigan 3 times in the last 6 weeks. So this is something that we think is important for the city, important for our community, and we have a superb team here, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thanks to all of our experts. As we mentioned at the beginning, one of the key pieces for tonight is making sure that we're hearing from the public and receiving your comments on the process and the technology that we've discussed tonight. And so I wanted to open up the floor now for those comments, and there are 3 ways to be able to provide insight for us tonight. One is the comment card that you picked up on your way here. If you're more comfortable writing down comments, or if you have histories or personal narratives or oral history from your family or documents and stories you want to share with us, please share that with us on those comment cards. Second is online at cityofTulsa.org/1921 graves. We'll be keeping the comment section for that site open after tonight's meeting so that those who aren't here personally can share their comments with us. And third is in person at the microphone that's here in the middle of the floor. I'll be the official timekeeper, so I'll be the annoying person flashing the yellow card when you have 1 minute left and the red card when your time is up. And 5 minutes per, we're trying to keep that to 5 minutes per comment so we're able to have everyone speak. And please, as I mentioned earlier, give your name and contact information to Christina in the front row so we can follow up with you if needed. But we do want to open up that floor now for any comments or questions that you might have of the technical team.
My contact, what do you want, my email address? I'm curious to find out if you guys have reached out to the Creek Nation or the Cherokee Nation. When you talk about that time period, Oklahoma had only been a state 13 years. Prior to that, particularly that gravesite at 91st and Memorial, was Louisa Chisholm's allotment, and who was a full-blood Creek Indian. And so you find this African grave on her allotment, which is unusual. So is the graveyard older than the state? And have you guys reached out to the Creek Nation their realty department that keeps records of all of our grave sites, all the way back to 1832? Okay, and then my second question is that 1,182,240 acres was allotted to Creek Freedom. Well, that was another 500,000 acres. Just with the Creek Nation, it was 1,182,240 acres that went to Creek Freedom. And that's a lot of land. Half of the county of Tulsa, south of the 412, were allotted to Creek Freedom. 80% of Wagner County was allotted to Creek Freedom. And a lot of graves are out there. These people have been here since the 1830s with the Indians, first as slaves and then as citizens. So have you reached out to them to get their stories?
I would like to
Yes, sir. I know as far as the 91st area, and I researched that area back in 2004 extensively because the development of that area that was encroaching on the burial site, which some know as the Abraham Lincoln Cemetery, but it was not documented as a cemetery until 2010 or so. I reached out when I found out that that graveyard, it does exactly what you said. That particular graveyard, Book 2 Washington, goes all the way back as far as the, not just burial, but it was the allotment of the Bruno family initially, which also came in his name as well. And over the years, there was even ordinances that were on that same property supposed to be a cemetery. In 1927, April of that year, a Hendry family created Booker T. Washington Cemetery, which later on became the ownership of Frank Cummings at that time. But I did contact the Creek Nation at that time, because at that period of time in the early 20s, that wasn't Tulsa County. Tulsa County was very small at the time. It was Creek County. So that's a lot of information. Those who do research, if you look in the Creek County records, you'll see a lot of those names and people. When I did contact the Creek Nation, I was immediately discouraged and said, no, that's if anything, that's Creek Freeman burial site over there. And they
citizens.
Yeah, that's what they told me, and quickly got me off the phone. So, yeah, they didn't want to.
So I encourage you guys that are on this commission to not just look at that day in 1921, but look at all the way back to the 1830 removals, because you're going to find those African graves here as well. And the fact that the allotments of the Creek Freeman were 1,182,240 acres. Half of Tulsa County went to black people at statehood. 80% of Wagner County went to Creek Freeman. Then you had Muskogee County, McIntosh County, Creek County, and Creek County was full of Creek Freeman children. So there may be stories that you're missing out because a lot of people in 1921 were Creek. You know, it wasn't until 1979 that the Creeks removed their Creek Freemen. But in 1921, the Freemen were citizens of the Creek Nation. And so a lot of people living in the city, as my dad used to say, they used to go to the city from Beggs, would come back, and they would go back and forth. So maybe you guys should reach out to surrounding areas, particularly out black towns around eastern Oklahoma, and see, hey, what did you guys hear that grandma might have said happened in 1821? Thank you.
Last time I was here, I had raised an awareness about the names of some of those that was massacred. And we don't know names. We might not know how many women and children were also massacred. And every time I think about that, that just breaks my heart. And it's a question I wanted to ask. The 1921, was there a census? Was there census for Creek County also? Because they say the 1921 census was also burned in the riot. How does the white man holds the census, so how did the census get burned? Am I right? The 1921 census was burned in the race riot, right?
I don't know, being a government property, I don't understand if you just toss a census records being burned. I never heard that part, but I'm quite sure they made copies some kind of a way that the government has.
I read that it was, the 21 census was burned in the, was there a census for 21?
I don't know, but I do know there was people that researched the census records from 1920, and the next go around of the census records, there was a different number of people who would reside in the Greenwood area, so it was a drastic drop at that point in time.
Because if we don't have names, we all live by our name. That's what carries us. Is our names is a memory. And names is very important to me. And it's just so sad that we don't even have the names of these, of most of
And that's why it's important that all of our families sit down and let's have that talk.
Yeah.
You know, use your cell phones, children, and sit down with grandma and grandpa and big mama and ask them about those stories of what happened. That's where it starts. Oral history, let the story continue. If not, we will continue this conspiracy of silence in its present form.
Yes. Well, I've checked for us, my ancestors and my great-grandmother and her people was from Mississippi. They didn't come to after 1921, but my great-grandfather, his people was here. That's where his people was right here. And it's just, I'm pretty sure all of us have ancestors, some kind of way, or people that we even know that have ancestors that was here. And it's very important that we hurry up and come up with more names of these people that was massacred. Thank you.
Are there further questions or comments? Don't be shy.
Good afternoon, everyone. While sitting here listening to the comments and talking about the 1921 massacre, I was thinking also with the gentleman, the native gentleman here, I was wondering how would you be able to distinguish the remaining bones of the African Americans from Native Americans? Because during that time, there were lots of deaths, unknown deaths, especially illegal deaths of African Americans and Native Indians also. So I was thinking along with him back there, his comment was very interesting, but I want to keep the focus on race massacre of Oklahoma here. And to my understanding, I think a lot of people migrated from Mississippi to Oklahoma, and they started their businesses there. And also, I think it was horrible what happened to our ancestors. And I hope that the committee can come up with an idea of how the descendants who are the survivors of the victims who were massacred in 1921, to give them peace of mind, give them comfort, and also retribution, because that was unnecessary, that was murder. It was uncalled for by the persons who murdered those African Americans in that day, based on a comment made by about an African American man towards a white female. So, overkill. And I hope that African Americans can be healed from that. First, second, third generation. It is emotional for me to sit here and listen to them. I'm a senior, and I know the pain that the African Americans have gone to. We're still going through pains today, being murdered illegally. So, but for descendants, immediate descendants of these people, give them closure, retribution, if possible, so they can feel valued. Their ancestors were noted for memory and recognized. They were innocent people. Thank you all for listening.
I want to speak to your couple of your questions. So you asked about distinguishing between people who are African American versus Native American. So our ability to do that will be based in part on how well preserved the remains are. But I can tell you that in the way that you expect to resemble your aunts and cousins and your relatives, not your siblings, say, but your more distant relatives, the bones of your skull have that same expectation. So if we get sufficient preservation that we're seeing intact skulls, like in some of the narratives of the disturbed burials, we will be able to, with good reliability, let's say like 80% of the time, distinguish ancestry in general. And by that I mean examine them and go African descent, European descent. The I mean, I am also curious about one aspect of this investigation as far as where Native American burials were at that time, but for the sites that we're investigating, I'm not anticipating the difficulty in distinguishing ancestry and its ancestry, so it's not the same as race, you know, because your skeleton is only interested in your biological relationships. And for the time period we're talking about, that will be closer to race identity as well. So we're not as caught in some of the like challenges of today of saying, you know, your biology says this, but your identity was what your identity. So I'm not as concerned about that. It's the preservation will be the first hurdle. They're more difficult tests if we have poor preservation. For example, one strong indicator of Asian ancestry, and by Asian I mean, well, this could be a can of worms for some people, but Native Americans have Asian ancestry, and it's reflected often in the shape of the incisors, especially the upper ones, the front teeth incisors, and they can have a nicely defined side walls, and that lasts through, you know, chewing and wear, and sometimes are visible down to the nubs. And when we see those, we go, oh, there's an Asian component, you know, there's some Asian ancestry. So in a modern incisor, it could be any Asian population. There's been a lot of immigration. But in an older population, deeper burial, you know, context, we go, oh, this might be a Native American. It could be a current resident for that time period, archaeological, you know, hundreds of years previous, and we would start hoping for other contextual clues. So there's a good chance we'll have at least the ability to discriminate between, oh, we found a burial of Native Americans as opposed to a burial of African Americans. Or what I expect to happen, burial of European descent individuals too, because there's got to be some associated with this event as well. And the irony will be that'll be the first burial we uncover. But at any rate, so in that regard I'm not as concerned. I think we'll get that discrimination. As far as retribution or closure about the harm caused to them, we might know if there's trauma associated with the cause of death, if it can show up on their skeletons, but it has to show up on the skeleton. So gunshot wounds, if it hits bone, if the bone is preserved, we might find that. Pellets still embedded, if it was shotguns, yeah, they're hard to get out. I can say that from experience. So we might recover that. Burning, though, I often consider burning to be a body. I'm sorry if I'm speaking bluntly. Some of you may want to do the la 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 la, but I consider burning to be body processing, not a cause of death. Generally, when I see it on remains, because I don't get this part where I can go, oh, they were alive while there was burning. So if we see that, if we see burnt bone, that's not necessarily a cause of death. And so what's the end of the story? You know, it's not, we can't put their life back in, and we can't even necessarily connect a harmed person with their family, but we certainly can have it be known that this is their story, even if the they, you know, is never identified.
And also I wanted to say that more hair does grow after death. Still grows.
Any more questions or comments?
I just wanted to say this, to look up there.
Put the microphone.
There was a U.S. census in 1920.
How about let her go since she was at the mic first? Since she was there, then if you don't mind speaking after her.
My question is, when you were talking about the death, your survey, I'm short. Okay, my question is, when you're using the machine, the ground penetrating radar, how deep does it go? Because I didn't hear that at the beginning. And then once you see that, I have noticed over the years growing up that trucks have come in from soil, from everywhere as a grave sinks, thank you. They continue to fill it and level it off. So you would be able to tell the type of dirt and rock and all that, and how long it's been there, and how deep the grade can be.
Yeah, so this machine right here can go down almost 30 feet if the soil conditions are right. And I can tell loosely I can't necessarily say it's all this X type of dirt, but I can tell that there's differences in the dirt, and I can tell that there's lots of rocks in it from the reflections that bounce back up. And so it's got to be really deep for you not to be able to see it with this thing.
No, I was just going to say, there was a census in 1920, U.S. census in 1920, and an Oklahoma census in 1920 as well. If that helps. There was a U.S. census in 1920 and an Oklahoma census in 1920. Okay. So we can find out information from that.
I'm just wondering, after y'all finish filing out everything, what y'all plan on doing? And that was my uncle you was talking to, the dude that you said you came back and I was waiting for 12 hours.
That would left.
Yeah. That's our uncle who Cherokee Freedom.
Yeah.
And they always been around here waiting for anybody else. But I'm just wondering what are y'all gonna do after y'all figure it all out? I mean, digging up bombs and everything is cool, but we're trying to, we didn't grow up too much. We want our stuff back if we could get it back, Like if I came and took y'all's stuff, you'll want it back. You'll go to jail. I'll go to jail for killing somebody.
Great point.
Now, and that's a great question, and covered this briefly at the last meeting, but I'm happy to.
Well, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
We can hear what you're saying.
They all had land, and like that man said, those wasn't just African Americans, those were freedmen, Creek, Osage, Cherokee. So y'all looking in the wrong place, and you can't go there to Tulsa County, they're not gonna help y'all find nothing. So you need to go find, talk to the Cherokee Nation, look at their records, to the Creek Nation. Now it's like pulling teeth, I'm telling you. Go and talk to them. But that's just what you gotta do. Because they're not gonna help you around here.
So you had asked just kind of what this process looks like. Like we talked tonight about identifying the sites, the technology that we use to do the initial survey.
Well, you have to go get the old records. You can't go off the new records.
I'm trying to answer your question. If you just give me 2 minutes and then happy to answer anything else. So we've talked tonight about identifying sites and then the initial kind of ground penetrating radar just or in other devices to identifying the anomalies. And then we've talked about the next step from there, if we find those places, which we believe we will because they've already been found once, is to do that excavation. And then I think Dr. Stubblefield makes a great point that what that excavation looks like, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. They're going to go do that, review that survey, and then bring those results back to this group. They'll be reported in a meeting just like this, and then we'll talk about what the next step is. If there is a site that's identified, then we're going to want to talk about what kind of excavation occurs. If this group agrees that an excavation is the right thing to do, then we would start that process. So if remains are found, then to Dr. Sobelfield's point, it really comes down to the condition that they're in before we can determine, one, if they're even from the race massacre, let alone the dream scenarios that we find out who they belong to, and that we can use both historical research and DNA to identify their descendants and connect them with them. Now, your question, which Reverend Turner brought up in the last meeting as well, is what happens from there? And I think that's an entirely fair conversation that so far, we're just trying to get through, to get off High Center where we've been for 20 years now, which is knowing that there are at least 3 locations that are high propensity, and start that investigation. And then connect, if we can connect or identify remains and connect them with descendants. We want those descendants to make the decision on what happens with those remains. We imagine, I think it's fair to expect that there'll be remains that we can't. If we find remains, we may not be able to connect them with descendants. This group's going to need to talk about what we do then. And then beyond that, whether that's a discussion around reparations or anything else, that's a discussion to have, I hope, once we've gotten down that path. We have to do it one step.
Reparations and we want, like, the land back would be perfect. I see a whole bunch of buildings and businesses getting built where I know my ancestors used to make a lot of money. They used to go to France, and this was the best place in the world for a long time. Trying to get that back, get back to that. It's not looking good around now.
And I just want to add, along with what you just shared, there has been a development in areas where we know African Americans, freedmen, Black Wall Street was. We don't mind calling it what it is. All of Greenwood is a crime center, right? And so, like, every square block of it is a crime scene. And just as we would do to protect any other place, we should protect this place. And so my encouragement, as I've already talked with the city about this, so my encouragement is to the community. Anytime you see a development, you just heard the professor mention that we lost bodies, remains that were found when they did the interstate. Those bones that were discovered, nobody knows what those are now. We need to be more vigilant. Anytime there is a development going on downtown, or any place we know or have suspicion that bodies were dumped or put or buried, we need to be on guard, because those businesses, there's a high probability they won't self-report, right? If you have a due date for construction, you're trying to put up a high rise by September 2020, and you find an elbow or a cheekbone, there's a high probability that business won't self-report. Even though by law, it's a felony. It's a felony to build over somebody's remains. It is a felony. And so we must be vigilant. I thank God for people such as Ms. Williams, who, when they were doing development down on Greenwood, and a lot of the plaques that marked where businesses and homes were literally desecrated, taken off, and not even replaced. If it had not been for documentation, those things would still be gone. Some of them have been gone. And so we need to do a better job of being vigilant and putting pressure on our city and the businesses and the zoning commission and those boards that when they give building permits to people, that they make sure if there is any sign of human remains, construction ceases that very moment. I don't care how much value it will bring in economic, business, and enterprise, you cannot put a price on the soul. And the fact that bodies are still not found to this day is an indictment on all of us. And the fact that those remains have been found, and we still haven't received any of those remains,
We didn't know.
that's a problem.
In school.
And
I didn't know about Wall Street in school.
Exactly.
They none of us
that in school. They teach history. Not our story. We never knew. Absolutely, none of us did. But it is on us today that those who came to this meeting tonight, to be on guard, because those who profited off of those businesses, those who profited literally off of the massacre, are still seeking to do the same thing. They won't self-report. If that were the case, people would have self-reported, oh, I dumped these bodies here I am, and here was the bodies. We wouldn't be here right now if folk did the right thing. There would have been more master if folks did the right things. But now, education, knowledge is power. And with knowledge is responsibility. And so now each of us, we know that we have elected officials that are charged with that. But we can't leave it just on them. Because historically we found we can't. I thank God for those who we have here tonight that are showing the effort to do some leadership. But it is incumbent upon each and every one of us. But every time we see a construction site on Greenwood, or downtown Tulsa, which is a crime scene, we need to have somebody on guard to make sure that just in case bodies are found, anytime there's a road modification done, we need to make sure somebody is on guard, because historically we found that these folk will not report. And I'm afraid of how many bodies we've already lost. That's my biggest concern, preservation. I'm afraid of how many bodies we have already lost. There's somebody just, some construction worker, some road paver, some enterprise just say, you know what, you just take off for the day. And we'll deal with this later. And you come back to work the next day and nobody sees where the bones were. And that is a sin, that is a felony, that's a crime. But the massacre was a felony too. And it still happened. But if we are going to be better than our predecessors, we must stand guard, and somebody must be on point. And that's black, white, yellow, brown, red, any ethnicity, heritage you come from. If you care about life, if you care about justice, if you care about truth, you ought to want to make sure if we can protect the preserves of every other place, if this was any other place, you couldn't build something in near where they had the Holocaust. You couldn't build, that's unthinkable. You couldn't build anything. I thank God for the niggas who stood against the construction of that pipeline. We have folk do it every day on our sacred land. And we just watch and we can't get for it to go because we want to move into those new high-rises. And they look good. I'm not against development. But what I am for is respecting the dignity of life. I'm for development that does not harm those who may be actually buried underneath that. That may mean housing subdivisions, that may mean anything. That may mean roads and bridges. But we must look out for the best and the most just and fair way of recognizing and remembering our dead. And we just ought to stop letting folk bulldoze over our sacred spaces. Thank you.
We're not against the government either, but it don't seem like they for us. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I just want to elevate what this young man is saying, which is this is a wonderful conversation, and it may not particularly be the space where Creek Freedom and Cherokee Freedom are going to get the answers, the return of their lands, the future investment, but we cannot limit or forget that the same attitude that caused the massacre is the same attitude that allowed for those lands to be stolen in the first place. And so if nothing else, the attitude that we're taking towards this should be taken towards providing justice to families like yourself. So I just don't want that to get lost. It's an incredibly important point that now two people have brought up tonight. So I would say it's clearly where people's mindset is.
What do you mean when you say that? I mean, we have a right to be angry.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And the attitude is the same reason why it happened.
We live in North Tulsa, no,
Yeah.
rifle, and we got 160 acres somewhere.
Oh, well, I'm with you, brothers and sisters. That's what I'm saying. I want to make sure,
We should be demanding it, really. They ain't nothing to talk about.
I just don't
This
understand,
was the
like,
first massacre.
I don't know if y'all understand me, but our
people, my people here.
One person talking, you stop
Okay,
now.
I'm
So
sorry.
She has the mic. So.
I don't think my people understand that our wealth was stolen. It was stolen. Meaning that we've been growing up in poverty and oppression because they killed our ancestors and stole it, erased us, and then they replaced us. And now me and my children are in poverty. I don't understand why the whole city not here. That's because I feel like, how you gonna trust your enemy? I don't believe the fact that you guys say that you don't know. I believe you know where each and every piece of a body is because it's y'all economic investment. You know where your money is. And when you said that you don't, that technology, now how is it though I can look on YouTube and they pulling up 2,000-3,000 years ago connecting DNA from then to us now, but we don't have the innovative technology. How do we trust and know that you guys are going to move forward and we can trust the fact that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, you're going to be honest. But I'm going to tell my people right now, cry out to the Most High because that's who's going to release it. That's what I did. The same records that they said was destroyed, God brought them right in my hands. You're not going to get it from who stole it from you. You got to cry out to the Most High. And you are right, brother, when you said that's the same attitude that God has done in the first place. Humble themselves. If my people will humble themselves and pray, cry out to that's who knows, that's who brought it here. I just want y'all to know that. The battle is on your knees. I just want my people to be ready to receive what God is supposed to bring back to us so that we'll not lose it again. But justice is in his hands. But he told me to tell the government and everybody else that it's time. It's just time, hands down. It's time. Just like he told Pharaoh, let my people go. It's up to y'all. We are covered with the blood, and I'm praying over everybody in our community, but it's so much. I'm praying that God open up your eyes and see what's going on. But trust me, I believe you can prove me wrong, that they know where every piece of a home is. Because it's their money, and that's how they can make the money. It's collective. Our wealth was stolen. Wake up.
Can I just add this? I understand the frustration. I understand that it's overtime, it's been time, beyond time, that this should have been done a long time ago. But at the same time, I'm very thankful for our mayor and councilwoman Maxine and this team that's been assembled. I think we've got a great team of people that have come together. And what I want to ask of you, myself, and all of us, to be patient. To be patient. This is going to take some time. I know it's been years coming, a long time. But we can't never get anything done unless we come together. We have to come together. And I'm so thankful that the team that has been assembled together for such a time as this. This is the right time. Those that were before didn't do the job. Should have done it a long time ago. But the process has begun. And we're here now. And it's going to take some time. We can't break up, be confused, fighting, and go against. We've got to come together as a unit. We've got to be one accord. And we've got to make this thing, all I'm asking from everyone, like you said, the prayer to be praying. Amen. And I feel like I'm in church over here, but be praying. And just be patient. Work with us. We encourage you to do that.
And I understand that, sir. And it's like, why is it that every time that we recognize what's been done to us is calm down, be patient, it's okay. We have a right to be angry. I understand the Black Panthers. I know that the Most High, that's not what he wants us to do. But I mean, it's okay. Don't. Let's come together. We've been pacified for so long. All I'm here is just trying to wake up our people and say, listen.
Don't even
You
know.
gotta cry out to the Most High because I don't trust you. And I have every right to feel that way. But what I'm saying is, it's okay for me to be a little, not a little, but like you said on that woman, you lucky that I'm not, that I'm only, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I have a right to be angry. I'm not being disrespectful.
No,
I'm
no,
just saying.
100%. I understand that myself. The
Right.
frustration, the anger.
Yeah.
I understand that. But what I want everyone to see is the team here. Black, white. I mean, we've got some people on this team that has never been assembled like this before. And we've got a committee, we've got some people here now. I mean, they are working. And so I'm just asking you all to pray and to be patient and to work with us as we go forward.
Right.
I believe this is the time now, and I really believe that we're going to accomplish some things, and we're going to see some things. And as the mayor said, I think one step at a time. The brother said, you know, what's the end result? Well, the process. It's going to take a little while. It's going to take a little while. But I believe we're headed in the right direction.
Oh, I definitely believe that as well. But I just want to make it clear that the purpose of me, the purpose of me commenting is basically to let those and whoever, know that God said it's time. So the trickery, the foolery, the lying, the hiding, no more. It ain't me, it ain't you. He gets the glory. He's going to get the glory out of this. I always say, when I saw him there on TV, and I said, Lord, you're going to use him. He's going to be the modern day king size. I already knew it. So all I'm saying is, he said, it's time, no more. It ain't me. It's coming straight through him. That's all I'm saying. So thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree, and it's amazing the Lord does indeed work in mysterious ways. There is a collective of people who also feel that now is the time and the season is right. One of them is a preacher that goes out to City Hall every Wednesday. Every Wednesday saying the exact same thing. Now is the time. And speaking, I don't know if he speaks loud enough for the mayor and city leaders to hear, but it is that notion that now is the time and now is the moment. And I do feel spiritually that this is all a part of God's plan. I would not be sitting here if I did not feel this was not a part of God's plan. Before Pharaoh let the people go, Moses sat down and met with him and told him what thus saith the Lord. So there is not anything negative about meeting and letting Pharaoh know what you're about to do. In fact, that's boldness. Terrorists go and they sneak like they did on Greenwood. They sneak and they bring airplanes and drop bombs. But real men and women of God tell you to your face what God is about to do. The real men and women of God, we come directly. And so I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I think what Bishop and I are saying is that do not shun the process of the liberation. Don't shun this coming together. In fact, I think I heard you say more people ought to be here because this is important for all of Tulsa to see and hear and to be a part. So I encourage you to continue to come. And there is an end goal, and we have elected officials on here, so I can't speak for them, but there is an end goal for all of this in mind. But I do think the work is all divine. That's all.
I want to just address what the young lady right here was talking about. I want you to know that I understand and I feel your frustration. I feel your pain. as an activist who has been on many corners yelling, speaking, knocking on doors to get our voices heard through changing the Brady name, through rebuilding BC Franklin Park. I know what it's like to share when you want to make a difference and the powers to be don't hear you. I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to go to people who look like me with suits on and establishment people who close the door in my face when we have had issues in this community. I know what it feels like. Believe me, I know what it feels like. And I'm also a Creek Freedman. So I understand what you're saying about the land. But this committee is dedicated to giving those bodies a proper burial from the massacre. That's what this committee is doing. And I can help you get connected to people like Eli Grayson, a Creek Freedman right back there, who can help you with the process of getting the land, because that is important. But again, this here is to give those bodies a proper burial. But that's why I'm sitting here. And City Hall, our District 1 City Councilor, Vanessa Hall Harper, if you go back to the Washington Post, we got tired of knocking on doors and trying to get people to hear us. You know what we did? We got 2 shovels ourselves and went to Oakmont Cemetery. If you don't believe me, Google that on the Washington Post. Because sometimes you pray, and the African proverb says, when you pray, move your feet. So that's what we are doing, and that's why we are here today. And I promise you, as an activist, just a human being to another human being, I am going to put all my might into making sure that our city, our mayor, everyone in City Hall, and everyone committed to this is going to make sure that it's done right. And if it's not, I will raise hell about it, believe me, okay?
Before we go on to the next question, these are important issues. I just wanted to reiterate the point. DNA is not ruled out. It's just later in the process. We have to have something to sample, but do remember your concerns, because there's steps, and I personally, in working towards any goal, genealogy or weight loss, or just living to get older, there's steps, and so don't forget, because questions like yours, they get washed out in the details as reports come out. So, but we will have some issue with DNA.
I would like to kind of reiterate on something the mayor told me when I first found out about this committee. Number one thing that sold me is transparency. That's the number one thing everybody is forgetting. The mayor has come to North Tulsa to bring this to us, to take your insights to make this happen. But like I say, he's not hiding anything. Like I said, this is a wonderful committee to be a part of. If you look at everybody on here and understand their background, no one has nothing to hide. Like you're saying, the time is now. It's kind of hard to believe, especially when you've been duped in the past on a whole bunch of things. Look at some of the people that's on this committee. A lot of you don't know them personally. They know that they're not part of anything that's to shut the job. They're about their business. I've driven all the way from Dallas to be a part of this as a servant. As I told the mayor, I want to be part of this to make a difference. Being patient, sometimes I don't have a lot to say, but the number one thing in all this that I hear that the mayor sold me on is transparency. So everything is open to everybody, creed, color, everything. So if you take that, like I said, I like to get things done sometime in a quick fashion. But sometimes that doesn't always take place. You have to pay for patience. And that's something I prayed about.
patience. So the patience in my life, I direct that in everything. Even on this, sometimes I just sit back and I listen. I have the same passion this young man has in everything I do. But sitting here, I prayed to God. I said, well, where can I reach out and touch this man and tell him? And all I can say is transparency. There's nothing that's being hid, like your sister or whoever the family member said. It's about time. And so with the time, with a combination of transparency, with the mayor by itself, like I said, you look at the past, no one has put on this type of magnitude, the weight is on his shoulder.
Yes.
So as a person, as a black male today, I reach out to the mayor to say, hey, anything or any way I can serve to be a part, just call. That's all I want to do is to be able to see the vision come to full fruition. And whatever the chip may land, I'm happy with it because everything was open, transparency. And that's just the one key word, just open. And like I said, even in everything we do, how many times people come to you and say, hey, I'm just going to be open. They don't. You have to read the fine print. Because they're not going to tell you, but right out the bat. Like I said, I commend my army because it's transparent. So give them a chance. Just, like I said, if you see something, pull it to the side. If you see something that you don't like, walk up to them and just ask. But give it time. That's all I ask.
Good evening. My name is Ton. I'm a descendant of the Wright. My family owned quite a bit of, a few buildings down on Greenwood. I also lived on Greenwood as a child. I have a question. During the excavation, are we allowed to be present?
Personally, I hope so, but it will depend on I have this vision of local people being trained to help with excavation, many hands, a lot of work.
Yes.
But, they have to be space. So we first have to get the size resolved. But there's no reason that you can, except, unless you get contaminated by remains.
If I can answer that really quickly, that is actually one of the key questions that we plan to bring back to this committee and have this committee discuss specifically. If we're moving forward with excavation, what kind of public oversight, what kind of public access is both respectful for that, for the remains and for the individuals that are being uncovered in that excavation process, but how do we have that kind of public transparency and have that public access to it if that's what people are desiring. So that will be a key piece that we'll be discussing with this committee in public at this meeting.
Well, would it be difficult, if it's a difficult place to search, if it's a difficult place, I've got a place in mind, I just feel it in my spirit, I feel it drop in my spirit, and this place is not being mentioned. I think it would be overlooked if I didn't say anything.
Why don't you talk to me, Deputy Mayor? You can speak.
I have a place, I've been dreaming it ever since I was little, but I didn't know, in my dreams I saw tombstones, but in reality there's like two places in particular. One place it's just flat land, there's nowhere, there's like activity around it, but there's nothing in the middle of this one piece of land, and I wonder why. And the other place is actually on Greenwood. My address is 522 North Greenwood. That number's been coming at me for a long time. I didn't even know you guys were looking for them for months. If I'd have known, I could have told you. I know a place. I know it sounds weird to you guys, but I feel it in my heart. I've got two places. I got a place for the bodies. I've got places that in my dreams they were bodies, but I think that they were maybe not artifacts, but belongings, possessions, One is right at 522 North Greenwood, and then there's the Brickyard Hill, which came 5 years after the massacre. Brickyard Hill was there, and I believe that they're beneath that. And at 522 North Greenwood, my grandfather had buildings. He had about 5 or 6 buildings, and there was oil. He had lots of oil wells, and there was oil, and there was a place for just oil supplies and stuff. When those buildings were taken down in the massacre, the only one that was built up was 522. And my mother told me that there were other buildings before, and I did my research, and there are. I think that's where they are, some of them, many of them. The buildings that were, the building that we grew up in was quite long, really long, and the other buildings were like parallel to those. That's this one building. They're down. It's right up over OU. It's in the parking lot where OU is. Brickyard Hill is right behind it.
OSU.
OSU. I'm sorry. They changed it, so it's hard to identify. I know the spot where we were. Because where the train tracks came down Greenwood, they were parted over, and we were at 522. There was a driveway that went behind us. Brickyard Hill was right there. But now, you can't tell where Brickyard Hill is. I mean, you can't tell where the building is because of the way they moved in that. They're under there.
If you'll provide your contact information to Christina, I'd love to have the historical committee be able to have that information and be able to reach out to you. That's okay.
Thank you.
And ma'am, I'd like to confirm what you stated as far as the brickyard is concerned, because we've been doing a number of stories on Fox 23, and people have been called. Now, they can be fantastic and unbelievable in crazy places. But one report did come out and say that bodies were thrown and incinerated at the brickyard furnace. So you hit it right on here. When you said that, it's, and there's only certain people I told about that discovery of that person coming forward. And that's what it takes. It takes people who know. It's always, Big Mom used to say, those who know won't tell, and those who will tell don't know. If you know something, say something, okay?
I didn't know you guys were looking for them. I haven't watched. I don't really watch.
We will talk.
It's
We
been
will
since
talk.
2012. But
Okay, we're closing this session at 7:30, so we do want everybody that stood up to speak.
My name is Mary Lee Weaver, and I just thank you all for what you're doing and the work that you are putting in. And I want to thank you all as well. And I want to give you reference to someone who has been doing this in a historical context in Europe. His name is Father Patrick Dubois. And what he has done is he has now discovered 1.5 million additional Jews that were buried in mass graves all over Europe, in Romania, in Germany, in Russia. And what he has discovered by going to small communities and talking to the elderly people of those communities, tell me what happened. And they cry and they mourn and they are so grateful that he has come to their community to ask them about their stories. And they will tell them where they are buried. And they will walk out to these sites. And some are in mounds and some have depths. But he has written 2 books, Father Patrick Dubois. He came here under an invitation of the Tulsa Jewish Federation 2 years ago. And in terms of what you were saying, Reverend Turner, in terms of honoring the dead, many traditions of faith want to do that. It's a corporal act of mercy to honor the dead. And so before there's any excavation, I would invite this committee to read some of the things that Father Patrick Dubois has done in terms of having an ecumenical honoring of the dead before any of those sites or anyone is excavated. We have lots of history to draw on. We have lots of people who have done this work. And I really appreciate all that you all are doing and your personal story is one.
We're going to have to close this out. We're going to have Senator Horner to come up.
Okay, my name is David Alexander Jr. I happened to learn about the race massacre in middle school at Roosevelt. Our teacher showed us 3 pictures. On those pictures were dead bodies laying on flatbed trucks. Now I learned about this in middle school, and I took it from there and researched, and I'm here today. I want to thank you people for this commission. But my commission, my passion, and my call from God, and I'm not a godly person, God told me to work on this. I want to, after you finish this commission, whatever, the next thing that needs to be worked on is to change the name of Greenwood. Now, the Department of Interior got in touch with Tulsa Historical Society, August 8, 2012, to change the name of Greenwood from 1921 Greenwood Massacre, race riot, 1921 race massacre. Now, I want to thank you for what you're doing. That's your thing. This is my thing. One last thing I want to say. This is not done by the goodness of the city. They are in a lot of trouble. You find out soon. Hear me now, believe me later. The city is not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. Because if you say, look at Greenwood. Look at the buildings going on around here. Nobody black. And you talk about your city's working with you, they laughing at you. I'm through. Bye.
Ma'am, we're going to try to close, but we want to hear your comment as quickly as possible.
Yes,
Okay. Talking to the mic. Oh, okay. I'm from Gore and Weber's Falls area, but I come up here a lot with my uncle and aunt. They lived at 1946 East Oklahoma Place. And back, how many of y'all remember Fabulous Food with truck driving around the city?
Yes.
He went to a lot of really high-class places, eateries and so forth and so on. And he was a very good man. No nonsense. He was in the Navy. His daughter is a librarian. She does genealogy real good, but she fell sick. And she told me one day that Dad was talking to her, he was talking about the massacre 21, and said that there was some burial sites out there at Mohawk Park, and what just hit my face when I had the leg, and I thought, oh Lord, He's working, because the Lord works through everything through Christ. He's mighty. And when we go into that battle, we can't have no fear. It says, fear not the one that can kill the body. Fear the one that can kill the body and the soul. And I totally believe that. But that sign is there because we was no nonsense family. We'd get our hind ends kicked when we didn't do right. But you know what? This is sad. I've got to keep on going I'm a widow. And I've got to keep on moving with my children because I've got a child that's 43, 33, and 37. And they're all half blind.
I lived in Gore, but I said, where's anybody else? And there's nobody any better than us, and you get that as your priority. I taught them well. And my daughter finally, she said, I'm getting out here, I'm tired of calling you the N-word because I'm going to kick their A-double bottom. Not like that. So she went on to Sequoia High School, graduated, and all this time, I researched things because my children know really well about me. I just wanted to say before Councilor Paul Harper speaks, I just want to thank the committee tonight for your presentation. And I want to say to those of you who are still here that please be encouraged in terms of what this committee, or what these committees will be doing and the hard work that they will be doing. Because I can go back with Scott Ellsworth, and here we are 20 years later, and we have to be very, very thankful for the fact that we had city officials who had the courage 20 years later, because first and foremost, we wouldn't be even in here, we wouldn't be having this conversation if former Representative Don Ross had not brought this to the attention of the state of Oklahoma. Scott wrote a book, but here we are. And so we are very grateful that we had a mayor who would step forward and a councilor who would step forward and welcome your input, welcome your being here. And so every step that we're taking, we want your input, we want your comments. So everything that's going on, you're going to have input in what's going on. And you may not like all of it, but the fact is that we're here and we're trying to move forward to take and make a correction to a situation that happened many, many years ago. But we're here today. And the fact that we have leaders here, volunteers here, who are giving up their time to work to try to make things better and honor the people that we lost during the 1921 race massacre. And again, I want to thank you for coming in before Council speaks. I just want to remind you to come back again at Rudisill Library. We will be here on August 22nd at 5:30. And again, we will welcome your comments and your feedback and everything that we're doing and anything we can be helpful with. We encourage you to participate, and we encourage you to be involved, and we encourage you not to be disappointed in what's happening or what has happened. What is happening now is that we're trying to make it better and honor the folks that we are trying to see what happened during that time. Thank you, and thank you for coming out this evening.
Good evening, and again, thank you for coming. I have one quick announcement. If you would please join us for an evening with Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt right around here in Library Hall. She is a Stanford social psychology professor. She is a MacArthur genius and an author of a book called Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice that Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Some of you, certainly if you live in Tulsa, you know that we are currently going through special hearings as it relates to the justice theme in Tulsa. Last night we had a special hearing. She was one of our special panelists on use of force in our law enforcement communities. And so those are other things that we're working on in the community. So she is there. She will be giving a lecture, and you will be able to purchase her book. She will be also signing her book. So please come out. She is world-renowned. She's been on NPR, Time, Forbes, The Daily Show, and other places, Trevor Noah Show, and others. So please come around. Just visit us. Well, come with us to the next event right down the hallway. Thank you so much.